High in the rugged mountains of Colorado, grizzled mountain man Samuel Creek thought he'd seen everything the wilderness could offer. Then he heard the crying. Deep in a rocky ravine, a tiny bear cub lay abandoned, its mother nowhere to be found. Any reasonable man would have walked away. Bears belong in the wild, not raised by humans, but something about the helpless creature stirred memories Samuel had buried long ago. Memories of his own son, lost to fever 20 years past. Against every instinct that kept him alive in these mountains, Samuel took the cub home. For 45 days, he bottle-fed the growing bear, taught it to forage, protected it from predators. The bond between man and beast grew stronger than either had ever known. Then the hunters arrived, and Samuel learned the terrible truth about his adopted cub's bloodline. But what secret did the cub carry that would change everything Samuel believed about loyalty and survival? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crying echoed off the granite walls like a wounded spirit, refusing to rest. Samuel Creek had heard many sounds in his 23 years living alone in these Colorado mountains. The scream of hunting cats, the howl of winter winds through pine needles, the death rattles of wounded elk. But this sound cut through his weathered defenses like nothing ever had. He knelt at the edge of the ravine, his worn leather boots finding purchase on loose scree that threatened to send him tumbling after whatever creature lay below. The crying came again, weaker now, barely audible above the whisper of wind through aspen leaves. Samuel's calloused hands gripped his walking stick, knuckles white beneath sun-darkened skin that bore the scars of decades wrestling with unforgiving wilderness. 20 feet down, wedged between two moss-covered boulders, a tiny bear cub struggled against the weight of fallen branches. Its dark fur was matted with blood and dirt, one small paw trapped beneath a piece of deadfall that would have crushed a lesser creature. The cub's eyes, bright amber catching the filtered sunlight, fixed on Samuel with desperate intelligence. Any sensible mountain man would have walked away. Bears meant trouble, especially cubs. Somewhere nearby, an angry mother would be searching, following scent trails with murderous intent. Samuel had seen what grizzly mothers did to threats against their young. He'd buried the remains of foolish prospectors who thought they could handle wild animals, but those amber eyes held something that made his chest tighten with forgotten pain. They reminded him of another pair of eyes, human eyes, brown like creek water over smooth stones, that had looked at him with complete trust during fevered nights 20 years past. "Easy, little one," Samuel murmured, testing the stability of the ravine wall. "Let me see what we're dealing with here." The descent took careful planning. Samuel secured his rope around a sturdy pine trunk, checking the knots twice before trusting his weight to them. His joints protested the strain at 58, his body bore the accumulated damage of harsh winters and physical labor that would have broken younger men, but his hands remained steady, his movements deliberate and sure. The cub whimpered as Samuel approached, too weak to flee but alert enough to show fear. Samuel spoke in the same gentle tones he'd once used to calm a frightened boy during thunderstorms, his voice carrying across decades of grief to find purpose again. "Nobody's going to hurt you, Scout," he said, the name emerging without conscious thought. It was what Thomas had called himself during games of hide-and-seek among the cabin's rooms, always the brave explorer venturing into unknown territories of imagination. The deadfall proved heavier than expected. Samuel braced his legs and lifted with his back, feeling muscles strain against wood that had absorbed years of mountain weather. The branch shifted, rolled, crashed against the ravine wall with hollow thunder that sent birds fleeing from nearby trees. The cub lay still, too exhausted to move despite its freedom. Samuel examined the tiny creature with hands that remembered caring for injured animals, checking for broken bones, internal bleeding, signs of trauma beyond the visible cuts and bruises. The cub's breathing was shallow but steady, its heart beating rapid flutter beneath ribs he could count through matted fur. But it was the fur that made Samuel pause. Most of it was the expected brown-black of common bears. But along the cub's shoulders and neck, silver-tipped guard hairs caught the light like precious metal. He'd never seen markings quite like these, though old-timers sometimes spoke of ghost bears that appeared in the high country during harsh winters. Samuel fashioned a makeshift sling from his spare shirt, creating a carrier that would keep the cubs secure during the climb back to ground level. The ascent tested his strength more than the descent. 50 pounds of injured bear cub made every handhold crucial, every footstep a calculated risk. At the top, Samuel paused to catch his breath and study his surroundings. No sign of the mother bear, no tracks or scent markers indicating nearby adult presence. Gauze. Either the mother was dead, or this cub had been abandoned for reasons Samuel couldn't fathom. The walk back to his cabin took an hour. Samuel moving carefully to avoid jostling his passenger. The cub had fallen unconscious, a mercy that spared it pain but worried Samuel with its implications. Unconscious animals often didn't survive, especially young ones whose systems couldn't handle severe trauma. Samuel's cabin squatted among tall pines like a patient creature, waiting for his return. Built from logs he'd cut and shaped himself, chinked with mud and stones gathered from the creek bed. It had sheltered him through more storms than he cared to count, but it had never sheltered anything as fragile as the small life he carried in his arms. Inside, the cabin's single room felt different with this new presence. Samuel cleared his workbench, spreading clean blankets to create a makeshift bed near the stone fireplace, where gentle warmth would help the cub fight off shock and exposure. He knelt beside the tiny form, studying the rise and fall of small ribs, listening to breathing that seemed too quick, too shallow. His hands hovered uncertainly above the cub's head, before settling gently on the soft fur behind its ears. "What am I doing, Tom?" he whispered to the empty cabin, addressing the ghost that had haunted these walls for 20 years. "Your pa never was good at the easy choices. The first night nearly killed them both." Samuel sat beside the makeshift bed he'd created near the fireplace, watching Scout's labored breathing while shadows danced across the cabin's log walls. Every few minutes the cub would whimper and thrash weakly, caught in dreams that might have been memories of falling or nightmares of abandonment. Samuel had seen enough injured animals to recognize the signs. The cub was fighting shock, dehydration, and whatever internal injuries the fall might have caused. Without proper veterinary care, impossible in these remote mountains, Scout's survival depended on basic nursing, careful attention, and something Samuel hadn't relied on for 20 years. He'd fashioned a feeding bottle from materials at hand, whittling down a piece of soft pine and boring a hole through it with his knife tip. A strip of clean cloth, soaked in warm milk, served as a makeshift nipple. The contraption looked crude, but Samuel's hands remembered similar improvisations from Thomas's infancy, when store-bought supplies were luxuries they couldn't afford. "Come on, little Scout," Samuel murmured, dipping the cloth in goat's milk he'd warmed over the fire. "Your body needs fuel to heal." The cub's lips moved weakly against the makeshift nipple, but swallowing seemed beyond its strength. Samuel persisted with the patience he'd learned during long hunting seasons, when success meant outlasting prey rather than outrunning it. Drop by drop he coaxed liquid into Scout's mouth, watching for signs that the tiny throat was working, that nourishment was reaching the stomach that barely rose and fell beneath thin ribs. By midnight, Scout had managed perhaps 2 ounces of milk. By dawn, Samuel had gotten another ounce into the cub's system, along with small sips of water sweetened with honey from his dwindling supplies. It wasn't enough, wouldn't be enough if Scout couldn't start feeding properly, but it was progress. Samuel dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake every time Scout's breathing changed rhythm or whenever the cub made the soft mewing sounds that cut through his defenses like nothing had in decades. Each time he woke, Samuel's first instinct was to check on the tiny patient, adjusting blankets, testing temperature with the back of his hand, offering more milk. The second day brought improvement. Scout's eyes stayed open longer, tracking Samuel's movements around the cabin with growing alertness. The cub even managed to lift its head when Samuel approached with the feeding bottle, though the effort seemed to exhaust the little creature. "That's better," Samuel said, settling cross-legged beside the makeshift bed. Starting to show some fight, he'd placed his most precious possession nearby, a faded tintype photograph in a cracked wooden frame. The image showed a boy of perhaps 8 years old, gap-toothed grin, bright against a formal studio background. Thomas Creek captured during their last visit to Denver before the fever took him. Samuel found himself talking to the photograph as much as to Scout, sharing memories he'd kept locked away for 2 decades. "Your brother Thomas, he would have loved you," Samuel told the cub while adjusting its position to prevent bed sores. "Boy had a way with hurt creatures. Found a baby rabbit once, brought it home in his shirt pocket. We raised it together until it was old enough to hop back to the woods." Scout's amber eyes seemed to focus on Samuel's voice, head tilting slightly, as if trying to understand the gentle words. "Thomas called himself Scout when we played explorer games. Said he was going to map every inch of these mountains, find every secret cave and hidden valley." Samuel's weathered hands stroked the soft fur behind Scout's ears. "Never got the chance to finish that job." The third morning brought Scout's first real feeding success. The cub latched onto the improvised nipple with surprising strength, drawing milk with the determined hunger of a creature choosing life over surrender. Samuel felt tension ease from muscles he hadn't realized he'd been holding rigid. "There you go, Scout, fight like your pa taught you." But it was more than improved feeding that lightened Samuel's mood. Something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere, as if walls that had held only echoes of old grief now contained the possibility of new joy. Samuel caught himself humming while he prepared Scout's meals, found excuses to check on the cub, even when no care was needed. The cabin began transforming into a nursery. Samuel moved his few pieces of furniture to create more space around the fireplace, hung additional blankets to eliminate drafts, even brought in armloads of fresh pine boughs to provide softer bedding. His evening routine expanded to include multiple feedings, cleaning Scout's fur with warm cloths, and the simple pleasure of watching the cub's strength return day by day. On the 4th morning, Samuel woke to find Scout sitting upright in the nest of blankets, tiny head swiveling to take in the cabin's details. When their eyes met, the cub made a soft chuffing sound that might have been greeting. "Well, good morning to you too," Samuel said, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "Ready for breakfast?" As he prepared the morning feeding, Samuel realized he was smiling, the first genuine smile to grace his features since Thomas's death. The expression felt foreign on his weathered face, but not unwelcome. Outside, snow began to fall in large, lazy flakes that would soon blanket the mountains in winter quiet. But inside the cabin, warmth and purpose had taken root in soil that had lain fallow for 20 years. 2 weeks had passed since Samuel pulled Scout from the ravine, and the cub's transformation amazed him daily. What had begun as a barely breathing bundle of matted fur had grown into a playful, curious creature that followed Samuel's every movement with bright amber eyes full of mischief. Scout had graduated from the makeshift bottle to lapping milk from a shallow wooden bowl Samuel had carved specifically for that purpose. The cub's appetite seemed bottomless. Milk in the morning, again at midday, and a final feeding before the fire died down to embers each night. Between meals, Scout explored the cabin with the fearless determination of youth, investigating every corner, every shadow, every interesting scent. Samuel's daily routines had evolved to accommodate his unexpected companion. Where once he'd risen with the sun to check his traplines alone, now he found himself explaining his activities to an attentive audience of one. "Today we're heading down to the creek," Samuel announced, securing Scout in a leather sling he'd fashioned from an old hunting bag. "Time you learned where the good water comes from." The walk to Samuel's usual fishing spot became an educational journey. Scout's head swiveled constantly, taking in sights and sounds with the intensity of someone experiencing the world for the first time. When a blue jay scolded them from an overhead branch, Scout made soft chuffing sounds in response, as if attempting conversation. "That's just old Jake," Samuel explained, nodding toward the bird. "He thinks he owns these woods. Been arguing with me for 15 years now." At the creek, Samuel set Scout down in a sheltered spot among the smooth river stones. The cub immediately began investigating, nose pressed to rocks still wet with morning dew, tiny paws testing the temperature of shallow pools where minnows darted like silver flashes. Samuel cast his line into deeper water, but found his attention divided between watching for fish and monitoring Scout's explorations. The cub discovered a small pool trapped behind a fallen log, and Samuel watched with growing amazement as Scout began fishing in earnest, not with the clumsy swipes he'd expected, but with focused patience that seemed far beyond the animal's age. Scout would wait motionless beside the pool until a minnow ventured close, then strike with lightning precision. Most attempts missed, sending the cub tumbling backward into the shallow water with expressions of such comical surprise that Samuel found himself laughing out loud for the first time in years. But some strikes succeeded. Scout caught 3 small fish during their morning outing, handling them with an instinctive knowledge of how to stun prey without damaging the meat. The cub even brought one of the fish to Samuel, dropping it proudly at his feet like a gift. "Well, I'll be," Samuel murmured, examining the perfect catch. "You're a natural, Scout. Your ma taught you well before whatever happened." The mention of Scout's mother brought a shadow across Samuel's mood. He'd seen no sign of adult bears in the area, no tracks or scent markers, indicating a mother searching for her lost cub. Either Scout's mother was dead, or the cub had been abandoned for reasons Samuel couldn't fathom. That afternoon, Samuel began Scout's formal education in wilderness survival. Using his grandfather's hunting knife, a blade that had served 3 generations of Creek men, Samuel demonstrated how to identify edible plants, where to find the sweetest berries, which roots could sustain life during harsh winters. Scout proved an eager student, though his attention span remained limited by youth and playfulness. The cub would watch intently as Samuel explained the difference between safe and poisonous mushrooms, then immediately chase after a butterfly that happened to flutter past. "Focus, Scout," Samuel said with gentle firmness. "Someday this knowledge might save your life." But even as he spoke the words, Samuel felt a growing unease. Teaching Scout these survival skills implied a future where the cub would need them. A future where Scout would live wild and free without Samuel's protection and companionship. The thought of eventual separation had begun haunting Samuel's quieter moments. Scout was growing rapidly, already showing signs of the powerful animal he would become. Soon the cub would be too large to carry in a sling, too strong to contain within the cabin's walls, too wild to live safely among humans. Yet Samuel found himself postponing that inevitable conversation with himself. Each morning brought new discoveries about Scout's personality, the way the cub would curl against Samuel's legs during evening meals, how Scout had claimed the corner of Samuel's bed as his own sleeping spot, the soft sounds of contentment Scout made when Samuel scratched behind his ears. "Your pa's getting too attached," Samuel told Scout during their evening routine. "That's dangerous for both of us." But Scout only blinked sleepily and nuzzled closer to Samuel's warmth, and Samuel found his resolve crumbling like riverbank soil in spring flood. That night, as Scout slept peacefully beside the dying fire, Samuel sat in his chair studying the cub's face in the flickering light. Already he could see hints of the adult bear Scout would become. The broader skull, the more pronounced snout, the powerful muscles developing beneath still soft fur. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, and Samuel thought he heard an answering call from much farther away. The wilderness was full of voices, each creature calling to its own kind. Someday, Samuel knew, Scout would hear calls meant for him, calls that Samuel could never answer. By the 3rd week, Scout had doubled in size and begun displaying behaviors that made Samuel's blood run cold. The playful swipes that had seemed charming when delivered by tiny paws now carried enough force to knock Samuel off balance. Scout's teeth, once harmless nubs perfect for nursing, had grown into sharp points capable of shredding leather. The change wasn't gradual, it happened in sudden bursts that caught Samuel unprepared. One morning, Scout would be the gentle companion who shared Samuel's breakfast, and by evening the same creature would be stalking imaginary prey with predatory focus that belonged to something wild and dangerous. Samuel spread his weathered territory map across the kitchen table, studying the hand-drawn boundaries that marked safe passage through the Colorado wilderness. Red ink showed areas where grizzlies hunted, blue lines traced migration routes for elk and deer, black X marks indicated spots where Samuel had encountered trouble in years past. "We need to talk about your future, Scout," Samuel said, though the cub was currently occupied with dismantling a pine cone near the fireplace, tiny claws working with surgical precision to extract every seed. Scout looked up at the sound of his name, head tilted in the questioning pose that never failed to tug at Samuel's heart. But Samuel forced himself to see past the endearing expression to the reality beneath. This was a bear cub, approaching adolescence, with instincts that would soon overpower any human training. The morning's fishing expedition had proven that point with unsettling clarity. Scout had caught not just minnows this time, but a full-sized trout that required genuine skill to land. The cub had dispatched the fish with efficient brutality, then consumed it raw, while Samuel watched with growing unease. "You're remembering things your ma taught you," Samuel observed, "or maybe things that don't need teaching at all." That afternoon brought an encounter that shattered any remaining illusions about Scout's domesticity. Samuel had been splitting kindling behind the cabin when a family of raccoons emerged from the nearby brush, chittering and quarreling over territory rights near Samuel's trash pit. Scout's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The playful cub vanished, replaced by a predator that moved with liquid grace and lethal intent. Before Samuel could intervene, Scout had cornered the largest raccoon against a fallen log, standing on hind legs with claws extended and lips pulled back to reveal impressive canine teeth. The raccoon fled when Samuel called Scout's name, but not before Samuel saw something in the cub's eyes that chilled him. Pure predatory instinct, ancient and implacable. For those few seconds, Scout hadn't been his adopted son. Scout had been a wild bear defending territory, with the same ruthless efficiency that had kept his species alive for millennia. "Easy, Scout," Samuel said, approaching slowly with hands visible and non-threatening. "They're gone. No harm done." Scout turned towards Samuel's voice, and gradually the wild fire in his amber eyes banked down to familiar warmth. The cub approached with tail wagging, a dog-like gesture that seemed almost apologetic, but Samuel noticed how Scout's muscles remained coiled, ready for instant action. That evening, Samuel consulted his map again, this time focusing on the areas marked in green territories, where black bears denned safely, far from human settlements and hunting grounds. Several locations lay within a hard day's travel, places where Scout might find others of his kind when the time came. But even as he studied potential release sites, Samuel found himself inventing reasons to delay the inevitable. Scout was still young, still learning crucial survival skills. Winter was approaching, and young bears needed experienced guidance to prepare proper dens. The cub had been injured recently and might not be strong enough for independent living. All reasonable justifications that couldn't quite silence the voice in Samuel's head, pointing out the real reason for hesitation. Samuel couldn't bear the thought of losing Scout, couldn't face returning to the solitary existence that had defined his life since Thomas's death. "You're being selfish, old man," Samuel told his reflection in the cabin's single mirror. "That boy deserves better than being somebody's pet." But Scout wasn't acting like anybody's pet. The cub had claimed the entire cabin as his territory, marking corners with scent and arranging Samuel's possessions to suit his own preferences. Scout slept where he chose, ate when he felt hungry, and obeyed Samuel's commands only when they aligned with his own inclinations. Most telling of all, Scout had begun leaving the cabin at night for solitary explorations that sometimes lasted until dawn. Samuel would wake to find muddy paw prints leading from the door, evidence of adventures he hadn't been invited to share. "You're already half gone, aren't you?" Samuel asked Scout during their evening meal. "Just haven't figured out how to make the break complete." Scout looked up from the fish he was consuming, amber eyes reflecting firelight in a way that seemed almost human in its understanding. The cub made a soft chuffing sound that might have been agreement, then returned his attention to his meal. Outside, the first snow of the season began falling in fat, lazy flakes that would soon transform the landscape into winter silence. Samuel watched through the window, counting each flake and wondering if this would be the winter Scout chose freedom over captivity. 1 month into their unlikely partnership, Samuel began each morning by examining Scout's sleeping form for signs of the inevitable. The cub's shoulders had broadened noticeably, his muzzle lengthened, his paws grown large enough to leave tracks that would alarm any tracker who found them near human habitation. But it was Scout's intelligence that truly amazed Samuel. The cub had learned to unlatch the cabin door using his claws, could distinguish between Samuel's different whistles and calls, and had even begun responding to complex commands delivered in the patient tone Samuel reserved for serious instruction. "Time for your lesson about humans," Samuel announced during their morning routine. He'd gathered a collection of animal bones over the years, remnants from successful hunts and natural deaths he'd encountered during his wilderness wanderings. Each bone told a story about predator and prey relationships, about survival strategies that separated the living from the dead. Scout examined each bone with scholarly attention, sniffing, touching, occasionally testing hardness with gentle pressure from his teeth. Samuel used the collection to explain concepts that might save Scout's life someday: how to identify the remains of animals killed by hunters rather than natural predators, why certain areas smelled of human activity even when no people were visible. "This elk femur," Samuel said, holding up a bone marked with distinctive saw cuts. "That's human work. Clean cuts, no tooth marks. When you smell that kind of processing, you go the other way." Scout tilted his head in the gesture that had become his trademark response to serious instruction. The cub's amber eyes remained focused on Samuel's face with an intensity that suggested genuine comprehension. The afternoon brought their most successful hunting expedition yet. Samuel had decided Scout needed experience with larger prey, something that would challenge the cub's developing skills while building confidence for eventual independence. They tracked a wounded deer through thick underbrush, following blood drops and broken vegetation with methodical patience. Samuel demonstrated how to read sign, the depth of hoofprints in soft soil, the height of disturbed branches, the pattern of blood droplets that indicated severity of injury. Scout proved a natural tracker, his nose leading them unerringly through terrain where visual clues disappeared. When they finally cornered their quarry in a small clearing, Samuel stepped back to let Scout handle the final approach. What followed was both beautiful and terrible to witness. Scout moved with fluid grace, positioning himself to cut off escape routes before closing for the kill. The deer, weakened by blood loss and exhaustion, offered little resistance. Scout's strike was swift and merciful, delivered with an instinctive knowledge of anatomy that no human teaching could have provided. "Your ma raised you right," Samuel murmured, watching Scout begin the process of field dressing his kill. "She taught you to be efficient, humane. That's the mark of a true predator." As evening approached, they shared their meal beside a crackling fire built in the clearing where Scout had made his kill. Samuel cooked his portion over the flames, while Scout consumed his share raw, both of them eating in comfortable silence that spoke of deep companionship. "Been thinking about your future, Scout," Samuel said eventually, poking at the fire with a stick to send sparks dancing toward the star-filled sky. "You're getting too big for cabin life, too skilled for the games we've been playing." Scout looked up from his meal, firelight reflecting in eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom despite their youth. "There are places in these mountains where bears live free," Samuel continued. "Valleys where the hunting is good, streams full of fish, caves perfect for denning when winter comes. Hard. Places where you could find others like yourself." The idea of Scout finding a mate, raising cubs of his own, living the life nature intended for him, should have brought Samuel comfort. Instead, it felt like contemplating his own death. The end of purpose. The return to solitude that had defined his existence before Scout's arrival. Problem is, Samuel admitted, I've gotten too attached to let you go easy. That's my failing, not yours. Scout finished his meal and moved closer to Samuel's side, settling against the man's leg with the casual affection that had become routine. Samuel's weathered hand found the soft spot behind Scout's ears, scratching gently while the cub made soft sounds of contentment. Your Pa Thomas, he used to sit just like this when we camped out, Samuel said, his voice thick with memory. Same trusting way, same belief that nothing bad could happen as long as we were together. The fire burned lower, painting shifting shadows across their faces. Samuel added another log, watching flames leap higher to push back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Maybe that's why I found you, Samuel mused. Maybe Thomas sent you to teach his old pa something about letting go with love instead of holding on from fear. Scout's breathing had deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, his warm weight solid and reassuring against Samuel's leg. Samuel remained motionless, unwilling to disturb the perfect peace of the moment, knowing that such moments were becoming precious because they were numbered. Samuel found the first set of tracks on a Tuesday morning while checking his snares near the creek. Boot prints in the soft mud, not his own, too large and too fresh. Someone had been watching his cabin during the night, circling at a distance that suggested caution rather than casual exploration. He knelt beside the clearest print, measuring it against his own hand. Size 11, maybe 12, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel that would make the tracks easy to identify if he encountered them again. The depth of the impressions indicated a heavy man, someone carrying significant weight in gear or weapons. Scout sensed Samuel's tension immediately. The young bear had been exploring the creek bank, but now he moved closer, amber eyes alert and ears pricked forward. Over the past weeks, Scout had developed an uncanny ability to read Samuel's moods, responding to subtle changes in posture or breathing that most humans would miss. Easy boy, Samuel murmured, but his voice carried an edge that made Scout's hackles rise slightly. We might have company coming. Samuel's cabin had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades, remote enough that visitors were rare and usually announced their presence from a respectful distance. Uninvited guests who skulked around in darkness meant trouble, either for Samuel personally or for Scout, whose existence Samuel had kept carefully hidden from the outside world. He pulled his brass compass from his vest pocket, the instrument his grandfather had carried during the war between the states. The needle pointed steadily north, but Samuel wasn't checking direction. He was thinking, calculating, remembering skills he'd hoped never to use again. The tracks led in a rough circle around Samuel's property, always staying just inside the tree line, where observation would be possible without detection. Professional work, the kind of surveillance Samuel recognized from his years in uniform. Someone had been studying his routines, mapping his territory, preparing for something that required detailed intelligence. We're going to change our patterns today, Samuel told Scout as they returned to the cabin. No more predictable schedules, no more exposed positions. Samuel spent the morning reinforcing his defenses, not against wildlife, but against human threats. He checked the firing positions he'd established years ago, but never expected to use, cleared sight lines that had become overgrown with brush, verified that his ammunition supplies remained dry and accessible. Scout watched these preparations with growing agitation. The young bear could sense danger without understanding its source, and Samuel's unusual behavior triggered protective instincts that were still developing but already formidable. That afternoon brought the visitors Samuel had been expecting. 3 men on horseback approached his cabin with the casual confidence of people accustomed to being welcomed wherever they traveled. Samuel watched them from his window, noting the expensive gear, the quality horses, the way they moved with predatory awareness. The leader dismounted first, a tall man with silver hair and clothes that cost more than most mountain folk saw in a year. He wore an ivory-handled pistol in a tooled leather holster, the weapon positioned for easy access rather than show. His companions stayed mounted, hands resting near their own sidearms with practiced casualness. Samuel stepped onto his porch before they could knock, keeping his own rifle within easy reach, but not obviously threatening. Scout remained inside the cabin, following Samuel's urgent instructions to stay hidden no matter what happened. "Afternoon," Samuel called, his voice carrying the neutral politeness that mountain folk used with strangers. "You gentlemen lost?" The silver-haired man smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Marcus Blackwood," he introduced himself. "These are my associates, Jenkins and Torres. We're hunting in the area. Wondered if you might spare some information about local game." Samuel had heard of Blackwood, wealthy Easterner who paid premium prices for trophy hunts, the kind of man who collected rare specimens the way others collected stamps. The type who saw wilderness as something to be conquered rather than respected. "Game's been scarce this season," Samuel replied, which was true enough. "Most of the elk moved higher up after the early snow. We're particularly interested in bears," Blackwood continued, studying Samuel's face for reactions. "Heard there might be something unusual in these parts, a silver bear perhaps. Local stories probably nonsense, but we pay well for accurate information." Samuel's blood turned cold. Scout's distinctive markings, the silver-tipped fur that made him unique among black bears, had somehow become known to hunters who specialized in rare trophies. Someone had seen Scout or heard about him, and word had reached the kind of people who would pay any price to add such a specimen to their collection. "Haven't seen anything like that," Samuel said, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. "Bears in these parts are common black bears. Nothing special about them." Blackwood's smile widened, and Samuel realized the man didn't believe him. Worse, Blackwood seemed to enjoy the deception, as if it made the eventual hunt more interesting. "Of course," Blackwood said, "but if you should happen to see anything unusual, anything at all, we'd be grateful for word." "Very grateful." He reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coins. $100 for information leading to a successful hunt. 500 if the specimen proves as unique as we've heard. $500 was more money than Samuel saw in 2 years of trapping and hunting. To men like Blackwood, it was pocket change. To Scout, it was a death sentence delivered with polite smiles and civilized language. After Blackwood's party rode away, Samuel found a spent bullet casing near his woodpile, a message as clear as if they'd carved it into his cabin door. These weren't ordinary hunters content with common game. They were professionals who killed for sport and profit, men who would eliminate any obstacle between them and their prize. Samuel examined the brass casing in the fading afternoon light. Fresh, probably .44 caliber, dropped deliberately where he'd be certain to find it. The metal still smelled of gunpowder, suggesting it had been fired recently, perhaps as a test or demonstration of readiness. Inside the cabin, Scout paced restlessly near the windows, his sensitive nose detecting scents that promised danger. The young bear had remained hidden during Blackwood's visit, but Samuel could see the strain in Scout's posture, the way his amber eyes darted between Samuel and the door. "They know about you," Samuel said, settling into his chair with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Someone saw you, or heard stories. Word got back to the kind of people who collect things that shouldn't be collected." Samuel pulled out his territory map, spreading it across the table where Scout could see the hand-drawn boundaries and annotation. Red ink marked dangerous areas, but now Samuel realized the entire region had become a killing ground, with Scout as the primary target. "Your marking, Scout, that silver-tipped fur makes you special. To me, it's just part of what makes you beautiful. To men like Blackwood, it's proof of something rare enough to kill for." Scout approached the table, studying the map with the intelligent attention he brought to all of Samuel's lessons. The young bear had learned to recognize landmarks, to understand the symbols Samuel used to mark water sources, shelter locations, and safe passages. "We need to talk about your mother," Samuel continued, his voice heavy with implications he'd been avoiding for weeks. "Black bears don't produce cubs with silver markings through normal breeding. Your mother was something special, and that's why she hid you so carefully. Samuel had been researching Scout's unusual coloration in his collection of wildlife journals, books accumulated over decades of wilderness living. The silver-tipped guard hairs suggested a genetic variation that occurred perhaps once in 10,000 births, rare enough to make Scout a legendary creature, valuable enough to motivate wealthy hunters to spend months tracking rumors. She knew they'd come for you eventually, Samuel realized, pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together. That's why she left you in that ravine, hidden where most people would never find you. She was protecting you the only way she knew how. The implications chilled Samuel more than the approaching mountain winter. Scout's mother hadn't abandoned her cub. She'd sacrificed herself to draw hunters away from him. Somewhere in these mountains lay the remains of a magnificent animal who'd died to give her son a chance at life. Samuel walked to his weapon cabinet, a sturdy wooden chest he'd built to secure his hunting rifles and ammunition. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay weapons he'd hoped never to use against human targets. His military service had ended decades ago, but the skills remained sharp, waiting for necessity to call them forth. "Your pa was a soldier once," Samuel told Scout, checking the action on a rifle he'd carried through battles that still haunted his dreams. "Before Thomas, before your mother, before this quiet life in the mountains, I've killed men who threatened things I loved." Scout seemed to sense the darkness in Samuel's voice, moving closer until his warm bulk pressed against Samuel's legs. The contact was comforting, but Samuel knew comfort was a luxury they could no longer afford. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across snow that had begun falling in earnest. Winter was arriving early and hard, which might work in their favor. City hunters like Blackwood's party would struggle with mounting conditions that Samuel and Scout navigated instinctively. But winter also meant limited escape routes, fewer options for concealment, and the constant need for shelter that would make them predictable. Scout was still young, not yet ready for the harsh independence that survival might require. Samuel examined the bullet casing again, turning it over in his weathered hands. The brass caught firelight like a golden warning, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "They're planning to come back," Samuel said, though he was talking more to himself than to Scout. "Tonight, tomorrow, soon. They'll wait until they think we're off guard, then try to take you alive if possible, dead if necessary." Scout made a soft chuffing sound that Samuel had learned to interpret as understanding mixed with trust. The young bear believed Samuel could handle any threat, solve any problem, protect them both from whatever danger lurked in the darkness beyond their cabin walls. Samuel hoped Scout's faith wasn't misplaced, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. These weren't wild animals following instinct. These were men motivated by greed, armed with modern weapons, and unencumbered by the moral constraints that kept civilized people from becoming monsters. The war Samuel thought he'd left behind was coming to his doorstep, and this time he wasn't fighting for country or principle. This time he was fighting for family. They returned at dawn, 3 riders emerging from the morning mist, like harbingers of violence. Samuel watched them approach from his position behind the cabin's reinforced shutters, Scout pressed low against the floor beside him, every muscle coiled with tension. Blackwood dismounted with theatrical confidence, his ivory-handled pistol gleaming in the weak sunlight. Jenkins and Torres flanked him, weapons drawn but held casually, as if violence were merely a business transaction they'd conducted countless times before. "Creek," Blackwood called, his voice carrying false joviality that fooled no one. "We need to have another conversation, more honest this time." Samuel remained silent, counting heartbeats and calculating angles. The cabin's thick log walls would stop most small arms fire, but his windows were vulnerable despite the shutters. Scout's breathing was barely audible, the young bear having learned to remain perfectly still during moments of danger. "We found interesting tracks near your creek," Blackwood continued, walking closer to the cabin, with the swagger of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Large paw prints, unusual spacing, the kind that might belong to something special. Samuel's finger found the trigger of his rifle, a weapon that had served him faithfully through military campaigns and wilderness hunts. The familiar weight brought back memories of battlefields where hesitation meant death, where moral certainty was the only thing standing between soldiers and savagery. "I'm prepared to be very generous," Blackwood said, now standing within easy pistol range of the cabin's front door. $1,000 for the location of the silver bear. $2,000 if you help us take it alive. $2,000 was more wealth than Samuel had ever possessed at one time. It represented security, comfort, perhaps even a return to civilized living for his remaining years. All he had to do was betray the trust of a creature who looked at him with the same unconditional love his own son had once shown. "Not interested," Samuel called back, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Blackwood's mask of civility slipped slightly, revealing something predatory underneath. "That's unfortunate. You see, we're going to find this bear with or without your cooperation. The only question is whether you profit from its capture or become an obstacle to be removed." Torres had been circling toward the cabin's rear, while Blackwood provided distraction. Samuel caught movement through a gap in the back shutters, professional flanking maneuver designed to eliminate escape routes and create crossfire opportunities. "Scout," Samuel whispered, using the tone that meant immediate obedience. "Root cellar. Now." The young bear moved like liquid shadow, disappearing through the concealed trapdoor Samuel had built for storing supplies during harsh winter. Scout's amber eyes met Samuel's briefly before vanishing into darkness, and Samuel saw understanding there. This was goodbye. At least for now. Samuel opened the front shutter just wide enough to show his rifle barrel. "Gentlemen, you're trespassing on private property. I suggest you move along before someone gets hurt." Blackwood laughed, the sound harsh against morning stillness. "Old man, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Make this easy on yourself." "I've been outnumbered before," Samuel replied, remembering battles where courage mattered more than arithmetic. "Sometimes that just means more targets." The first shot came from Torres, positioned behind Samuel's woodshed. The bullet splintered wood near Samuel's head, close enough to draw blood from flying debris. Samuel's return fire was immediate and accurate. Torres stumbled backward, clutching a wounded shoulder. Jenkins opened fire from behind Blackwood's horse, forcing Samuel to duck away from the window. Bullets punched through the cabin's shutters, sending wood splinters flying like angry wasps. Samuel rolled across the floor, changing position to avoid concentrated fire. "Give us the bear, Creek," Blackwood shouted over the gunfire. "This doesn't have to end with your death." Samuel's response was a carefully aimed shot that sent Jenkins diving for better cover. The man's expensive rifle went flying, landing in snow that was rapidly being churned into bloody slush by the ongoing battle. From his position near the cabin's rear, Samuel could hear Torres cursing and trying to reload one-handed. The wounded man was out of the fight temporarily, but that still left two armed opponents who showed no inclination toward mercy or restraint. "You're fighting for an animal, Creek," Blackwood called, his voice edged with frustration. "A dumb beast that doesn't even understand what you're sacrificing for it." Samuel thought about Scout hiding in the root cellar, probably listening to gunfire and wondering if his human father would survive to see another day. The young bear might be many things, but dumb wasn't one of them. "That dumb beast has more honor than all three of you combined," Samuel called back, ejecting a spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The battle was just beginning, and Samuel knew his ammunition wouldn't last forever. But every minute he held them here was another minute Scout had to escape into wilderness, where men like Blackwood couldn't follow. In the brief lull between gunshots, Samuel's hands worked with desperate efficiency, fashioning a collar from strips of leather he'd been saving for winter repair. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was attempting. If Scout wore a collar, if Samuel could convince the hunters that the young bear was a trained animal rather than wild prey, perhaps they might lose interest. It was a desperate gamble built on the slim hope that men motivated by the thrill of hunting legendary creatures might find domesticated bears less appealing. "Scout," Samuel whispered toward the root cellar's concealed entrance. "Come up. But stay low. The young bear emerged from hiding with silent grace, immediately sensing the urgency in Samuel's movements. Scout had grown so much in their weeks together that the improvised collar barely fit, but Samuel managed to secure it around the bear's thick neck. "You're going to have to trust me," Samuel said, looking into amber eyes that held complete faith, despite the chaos surrounding them. "I'm going to try something that might save us both, but it means pretending to be something you're not." Outside, Blackwood's voice carried clear menace. "We know you've got supplies in there. We can wait longer than you can." Samuel checked his ammunition, 6 rounds remaining in the rifle, perhaps a dozen more scattered around the cabin. Against 3 determined men with military-grade weapons, it wouldn't be enough for a prolonged siege. "I'm coming out," Samuel called, making the hardest decision of his life. "Don't shoot." He opened the cabin door slowly, rifle held high but not threatening, Scout at his side, wearing the leather collar like some exotic pet. Blackwood's eyes widened when he saw the young bear, and Samuel caught the moment of recognition. This was indeed the silver-marked creature they'd been hunting. "Gentlemen," Samuel said with forced calm, "I'd like you to meet Scout, my trained." Blackwood lowered his pistol slightly, confusion replacing predatory certainty. "Trained? Found him as an orphaned cub. Raised him from bottle feeding. He's as tame as a house dog. Follows commands, performs tricks for visitors. Not much sport in hunting a pet, I'd imagine." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited for their reaction. Scout remained perfectly still beside him, somehow understanding that their lives depended on appearing domestic rather than wild. Jenkins, still nursing his wounded pride along with scattered bruises, sneered from his position behind the overturned woodshed. "Trained bear my ass. That thing's wild as a tornado." "Scout, sit," Samuel commanded. Scout immediately dropped to his haunches, tilting his head in the questioning pose that had become his signature gesture. The display of obedience was so natural, so clearly the result of long association, that even Torres stopped trying to tend his wounded shoulder to stare. "Roll over," Samuel continued, praying Scout would remember their playful training sessions. The young bear dropped to his side and rolled completely over, then returned to sitting position, with the fluid grace of an animal comfortable with human commands. Blackwood's expression shifted from predatory hunger to something approaching disappointment. "Son of a bitch really is trained," Torres muttered, his voice carrying the deflation of a man realizing his prize had lost its value. But Blackwood wasn't convinced yet. Samuel could see calculation in the man's pale eyes, the wheels turning as he weighed options and probabilities. "Interesting pet," Blackwood said slowly, "but trained animals can be untrained. Return to the wild, so to speak. Might be interesting to see how quickly domestic instincts give way to natural ones." The threat was clear. Blackwood intended to take Scout regardless, to release him in controlled conditions where the hunt could proceed as planned. Samuel felt his last hope crumbling like riverbank soil in spring flood. "Scout's not going anywhere," Samuel said, his voice hardening with resolve that came from depths he'd forgotten he possessed. "Oh, but he is," Blackwood replied, raising his pistol again. "The question is whether he leaves with a living owner or a dead one." Samuel's mind raced through possibilities, each more desperate than the last. 3 armed men, open ground, limited ammunition. Military training suggested retreat and regrouping, but there was nowhere to run that wouldn't expose Scout to capture. "Tell you what, Creek," Blackwood continued, seeming to enjoy Samuel's obvious desperation. "Give us the bear willingly, and we'll let you live to find another pet. Force us to take him, and you'll feed the wolves before sunset." Samuel's hand found Scout's head, fingers tangling in the soft fur behind the bear's ears. The young animal pressed against his leg with trusting warmth, completely dependent on human protection, in a situation where that protection might not be enough. "He's not just a pet," Samuel said quietly, the words carrying weight that surprised even him. "He's my son." The declaration hung in the cold mountain air like morning mist, and Samuel realized he'd spoken nothing but truth. Somewhere during their weeks together, Scout had become the family Samuel thought he'd lost forever. The first shot shattered the morning stillness like breaking glass. Samuel didn't wait to see where Blackwood's bullet struck. He was already moving, grabbing Scout and diving behind the cabin's thick log wall as gunfire erupted from 3 directions. "Run, Scout," Samuel shouted over the chaos. "Deep woods like I taught you." But Scout didn't run. Instead, the young bear positioned himself between Samuel and their attackers, every muscle coiled with protective fury that belonged to something far older and more dangerous than his month suggested. Samuel had seen Scout's predatory instincts emerge gradually over their weeks together, but nothing had prepared him for the transformation that occurred when those he loved faced mortal threat. The playful cub vanished, replaced by a creature that moved with liquid death, amber eyes blazing with primal intelligence. Torres, still favoring his wounded shoulder, made the mistake of approaching too close to their position. Scout's charge was explosive, a blur of silver-tipped fur and gleaming claws that covered 20 yards in heartbeats. The hunter's scream cut through gunfire as Scout's weight drove him backward into the snow. "Christ Almighty!" Jenkins shouted, swinging his rifle toward the bear that had just eliminated one of their number, with terrifying efficiency. Samuel's shot took Jenkins in the chest before the man could fire, the military training of decades past, asserting itself with deadly precision. The hunter spun and fell, his expensive rifle clattering across ice-crusted ground. But Blackwood was the real threat, experienced, calculating, and armed with more than just weapon. The man had positioned himself behind Samuel's woodshed, with clear sightlines to both the cabin and the surrounding terrain. "Magnificent," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying genuine admiration, despite the violence surrounding them. "Simply magnificent. This is what true hunting should be, predator against predator, intelligence against instinct." Scout had finished with Torres and now stood over the fallen hunter, breathing hard but alert for new threats. A piece of torn fabric hung from the bear's claws, evidence of how close the encounter had been, how quickly domestic training had given way to survival instincts. "Scout, to me," Samuel commanded, but his voice carried uncertainty. The young bear that had responded to commands moments earlier was gone, replaced by something wild and magnificent and dangerous. For a heartbeat that seemed to last hours, amber eyes met Samuel's across the blood-stained snow. Samuel saw recognition there, but also something new, the acknowledgement that their relationship had fundamentally changed. Scout was no longer his dependent cub. Scout was his equal partner in a fight for their lives. The bear moved towards Samuel with fluid grace, positioning himself where he could watch both their remaining enemy and protect the human who had raised him from helpless infancy. "You trained him well, Creek," Blackwood shouted, his voice filled with the excitement of a man finally facing worthy prey. "But training only goes so far. Eventually nature wins over nurture." Blackwood's next shot came close enough to spray Samuel with bark fragments from the cabin wall. Samuel rolled away from his position, forcing Blackwood to adjust his aim, while Scout circled toward the woodshed with predatory patience. "Your boy there," Blackwood continued, "he's got the killing instinct now. Tasted blood, felt the rush of successful hunt. Think he'll go back to being your pet after this?" Samuel's return shot splintered wood near Blackwood's position, but missed the man himself. His ammunition was running dangerously low, while Blackwood seemed to have an endless supply. "Maybe I should thank you," Blackwood called, repositioning himself for a better angle. "You've turned a tame bear into something truly wild. The hunt I'll get from him now will be legendary." Scout had reached the woodshed's blind side, moving with stealth that would have impressed his wild ancestors. Samuel could see the bear's muscles bunching for another explosive charge, but this time their enemy was ready. Blackwood's ivory-handled pistol tracked Scout's movement with deadly precision. Samuel realized with sick certainty that the hunter had been baiting Scout into exactly this position, using Samuel as distraction while maneuvering for a clear shot at his real prize. "Scout!" No, Samuel screamed, but the warning came too late. The young bear launched himself at Blackwood with all the fury and protective love that had driven him to fight for his human father. Samuel's rifle cracked simultaneously with Blackwood's pistol, both weapons firing at targets they couldn't afford to miss. Time seemed suspended in that moment, the echo of gunshots rolling across snow-covered peaks, while two creatures who had found family in each other faced the possibility of losing everything that mattered. In the silence that followed, only the wind spoke, carrying the scent of gunpowder and blood, and the changing of seasons that would transform everything they had known together. Samuel's hands shook as he pulled the tarnished military medal from its hiding place beneath his cabin's loose floorboard. The bronze star caught firelight like a guilty secret. Its ribbon faded, but the inscription still clear. Sergeant Samuel Creek, 2nd Colorado Infantry, for valor above and beyond the call of duty. Scout lay nearby, breathing steadily despite the blood matting his silver-tipped fur. Blackwood's bullet had grazed the young bear's shoulder, painful but not fatal, thanks to Samuel's shot that had spoiled the hunter's aim at the crucial moment. Blackwood himself lay motionless beside the woodshed, his ivory-handled pistol fallen from lifeless fingers. Samuel's final bullet had found its mark with the deadly precision of a man who had once been the finest marksman in his regiment. "Didn't want you to see this side of me," Samuel said, showing Scout the medal that represented memories he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. "Your pa was a different man during the war. Had to be, if he wanted to survive what we faced." The medal represented more than military service. It symbolized the tactical knowledge that had kept Samuel alive through battles where courage alone wasn't enough. He'd learned to read terrain, predict enemy movements, use every advantage that training and experience could provide. Gettysburg, Antietam, Bull Run, Samuel continued, naming battlefields where he'd watched friends die and enemies fall. Places where good men killed other good men because somebody else decided it was necessary. Scout's amber eyes remained fixed on Samuel's face, and the man could see understanding there. The young bear had witnessed Samuel's transformation from gentle caregiver to deadly protector, had seen firsthand what happened when peaceful men were forced to embrace violence. "But I swore when Thomas was born that I'd never be that man again," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Promised myself I'd found a better way to live. Up here where nobody asked me to kill for causes I didn't understand." The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's damaged shutters, illuminating bloodstains that would serve as permanent reminders of the morning's violence. Samuel had dragged the bodies away from the cabin, giving them the basic decency of burial despite what they'd tried to do. Torres had died instantly from Scout's attack. The bear's protective fury had been swift and decisive. Jenkins had lived long enough to curse Samuel's marksmanship before shock and blood loss claimed him. Blackwood had died with his eyes open, staring at the sky as if surprised that his wealth and connections couldn't purchase immunity from mountain justice. "They thought they were hunting you," Samuel told Scout, gently cleaning the bear's wounded shoulder. "But they were wrong. They were hunting something else entirely, a father protecting his son." Scout submitted to Samuel's ministrations with patient trust, understanding that the hands that had killed their enemies were the same hands that had bottle-fed him through his first difficult nights. The young bear seemed to grasp the complexity of love that could be both gentle and violent, protective and nurturing. Samuel examined his own wounds, nothing serious, mostly cuts from flying wood splinters and bruises from diving behind cover, but the emotional damage went deeper than anything Blackwood's bullets could have inflicted. "I wanted better for you," Samuel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wanted you to know the world as a place where problems could be solved with patience and kindness. But some problems don't respond to gentle solutions. Outside, their horses wandered loose, expensive animals that would eventually find their way back to civilization, carrying news of what had happened in the high country." Samuel knew there would be questions, investigations, perhaps visits from law enforcement officials who specialized in violent deaths. But all of that belonged to a future he couldn't control. Right now, only Scout mattered, making sure the young bear recovered from his wounds, ensuring that their bond survived the violence that had transformed them both. "Your mother would be proud," Samuel said, thinking of the magnificent animal who had died protecting her cub from exactly this kind of threat. "She taught you to fight when fighting was necessary, but she also knew when to hide, when to run, when survival mattered more than pride." Scout made a soft chuffing sound that Samuel had learned to interpret as contentment mixed with affection. Despite everything they'd endured, despite the blood on both their hands and claws, the connection between them remained unbroken. "We can't stay here," Samuel realized, looking around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for over 2 decades. Too many questions coming, too much attention from people who won't understand what happened here. The wilderness stretched beyond his broken shutters, vast and unforgiving but free from the complications that came with civilization. Somewhere out there lay territories where a man and his adopted bear son could disappear completely, could start fresh, without the weight of past violence following them. Samuel's fingers traced the medal's familiar edges, one final time before returning it to its hiding place. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, even from those we love most. The wooden cross stood weathered and alone among the aspens, its simple inscription barely visible after 20 years of mountain storms. Thomas Creek, beloved son. Samuel knelt before the grave he'd carved from frozen ground with his own hands, Scout pressed warm against his side. "This is where we say goodbye to everything, son." Samuel whispered, his weathered fingers tracing letters he'd carved through tears and desperate grief. "Your brother Thomas, he's been waiting here all this time for me to figure out how to let go." Scout seemed to sense the sacred nature of this place, remaining perfectly still except for the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. The young bear's shoulder wound was healing cleanly, but Samuel could see new weariness in amber eyes that had witnessed too much violence for their age. Below them, smoke still rose from the direction of Samuel's cabin. He'd set the fire himself before beginning this final pilgrimage. Better to burn everything than leave evidence for investigators who would ask questions. Samuel couldn't answer without revealing Scout's existence. "I brought you something," Samuel continued, pulling a small wooden bear from his pack. He'd carved it during Scout's first week of recovery, working by firelight while the cub slept peacefully nearby. The figure captured Scout's questioning head tilt, the alert ears, the intelligent eyes that had first looked at Samuel with complete trust. "Your pa's not much of an artist, but he tried to show what you mean to him." Samuel placed the carving against Thomas's headstone, where wind and weather would eventually claim it just as they'd claimed everything else in these mountains. But for now, it served as a bridge between past and present, between the son he'd lost and the one he'd found. "Thomas would have loved you," Samuel said, his voice breaking with the weight of 20 years' accumulated sorrow. "He had your curiosity, your courage, your way of making people believe in tomorrow even when today looked hopeless." Scout made a soft sound that might have been understanding or comfort, or simply the acknowledgement that grief was a burden meant to be shared. The young bear had grown so much during their weeks together, not just in size and strength, but in wisdom that came from experiencing both love and loss. But he's gone, and you're here, and your pa has to make choices that hurt worse than anything Blackwood's bullets could have done. The truth Samuel had been avoiding settled between them like winter cold. Scout was no longer the helpless cub he'd rescued from the ravine. The young bear had tasted blood, felt the rush of protecting those he loved, proven himself capable of violence when violence was necessary. These weren't skills that belonged in human society. More importantly, Scout deserved better than a life spent hiding from his true nature. He deserved the freedom to grow into the magnificent predator his genetics promised, to find a mate, to raise cubs of his own in wilderness where silver-tipped fur would be celebrated rather than hunted. "Down in that valley," Samuel said, pointing toward the distant tree line, where morning mist still clung to ancient pines, "there's a place your mother might have shown you if she'd lived. Bear country where the fishing is good and humans never go." Scout's head turned to follow Samuel's gesture, and for a moment man and bear studied the landscape that would become Scout's inheritance. "I can't come with you," Samuel continued, each word costing him years of accumulated strength. "Not because I don't want to, but because you need to learn who you really are. And you can't do that with your old pa holding you back." Samuel reached into his pack again, retrieving the leather collar he'd fashioned during their desperate gambit with Blackwood. The collar that had briefly transformed Scout from wild creature to domestic companion, from free spirit to captive pet. "This was my mistake," Samuel said, his hands working to unbuckle the leather straps. "Trying to make you something you weren't. instead of helping you become everything you were meant to be. The collar fell away, and Scout shook himself with obvious relief. The restriction he'd endured for Samuel's sake was gone, leaving him free to choose his own path forward. "There's a family of bears in that valley," Samuel continued, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Good bears, the kind that will teach you things your pa never could. Things about being wild, about surviving winters, about finding your place in the natural order." Scout stepped closer, pressing his massive head against Samuel's chest with gentle insistence. The gesture was pure affection, uncomplicated by the violent necessities that had transformed them both. "I know," Samuel whispered, his arms wrapping around Scout's thick neck one final time. "I know you don't want to leave any more than I want you to go. But love sometimes means making the hard choice, the right choice, even when it breaks your heart." Above them, clouds gathered with the promise of early snow, and Samuel realized their time of decision had arrived. The descent into bear country took 3 hours of careful navigation through terrain that grew wilder with each step. Samuel led the way, following game trails that wound between granite outcroppings and stands of ancient pine, while Scout moved beside him with the fluid grace of an animal returning to his natural element. They encountered the first sign of resident bears, near a stream where salmon runs had carved deep pools in the rocky streambed. Fresh tracks in the muddy banks, claw marks on nearby trees, the distinctive scent markers that proclaimed territorial boundaries to those who knew how to read them. "This is good country," Samuel observed, kneeling to examine paw prints that dwarfed even Scout's impressive tracks. Adult female, probably with cubs somewhere nearby. The kind of family that might accept a young male who knows how to behave properly. Scout investigated the scent markers with intense concentration, his sensitive nose processing information that remained mysterious to human senses. Samuel watched the young bear's body language shift subtly, ears more alert, posture more upright, movements that spoke of recognition and anticipation. "You remember this, don't you?" Samuel said quietly. "Deep down, some part of you remembers what it means to be wild." They followed the stream deeper into the valley, where signs of bear presence became impossible to ignore. Fish bones scattered along the banks, berry bushes stripped clean with methodical efficiency, daybeds pressed into soft earth beneath overhanging rocks. And then they saw her. The female bear emerged from thick brush with the confident stride of an animal absolutely secure in her domain. She was magnificent, easily twice Scout's current size, with the broad skull and powerful shoulders that marked her as a mature. Her coat was the deep brown-black of healthy wild bears, unmarked by the silver tipping that made Scout unique. 2 cubs followed in her wake, perhaps 6 months old, and showing the playful curiosity that characterized young bears everywhere. They tumbled over each other in mock combat, pausing occasionally to study the strange intruders who had entered their territory. Samuel felt Scout tense beside him, every muscle coiled with uncertainty and longing. The young bear had never encountered others of his kind, never learned the complex social protocols that governed bear interactions. Yet something deeper than training seemed to guide his movements as he took a cautious step forward. The female noticed them immediately, rising on her hind legs to assess the potential threat. At full height, she was truly impressive, a living reminder of the power and dignity that Scout might achieve if given the chance to grow wild and free. "Easy, mother," Samuel murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing the bear or Scout or himself. "We're not here to challenge your family." Scout took another step forward, his posture submissive, but not fearful. Some instinct seemed to guide him toward the proper approach for a young male requesting acceptance from an established family group. The female dropped to all fours, studying Scout with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She could see his size, his age, his potential for both cooperation and competition. Most importantly, she could sense that he posed no immediate threat to her cubs. What followed was a complex ritual of approach and retreat, challenge and submission, that played out according to rules older than human memory. Scout demonstrated his fishing skills by catching a trout from the stream, then respectfully retreated when the female claimed it for her cubs. He showed deference by avoiding direct eye contact while still maintaining the alert posture of a bear, confident in his own abilities. Samuel watched this ancient dance with emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Pride at Scout's instinctive knowledge, sorrow at the inevitable separation, hope that the young bear might find the belonging he deserved. The female's cubs proved crucial to their eventual acceptance. Young bears possessed the same curiosity about unusual playmates that characterized children of all species, and Scout's patient tolerance of their rough games apparently impressed their mother. By afternoon, Scout was fishing alongside his new family, while Samuel watched from a respectful distance. The young bear's technique had improved dramatically in just hours of observation and practice with experienced partners. "You're learning fast," Samuel said during a quiet moment when Scout approached the place where he waited. "Learning things I could never teach you." Scout pressed against Samuel's legs with the familiar gesture of affection, but something had changed in the young bear's manner. He was still loving, still connected to his human father, but part of his attention remained focused on his new family. "It's time," Samuel realized, the words costing him everything he had left to give. "You've found where you belong." He reached into his pack one final time, withdrawing a piece of equipment that had belonged to Blackwood, a leather strap from the dead hunter's rifle sling, marked with silver conchos that caught the afternoon light. "Your trophy," Samuel said, securing the leather around Scout's neck like a collar that proclaimed victory rather than captivity. "So you'll remember that you're a bear who fought for his family and won." Samuel sat alone beside his cold campfire as dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. His left shoulder throbbed from wounds that refused to heal properly, and the persistent cough that had developed during their weeks on the run suggested damage that went deeper than surface injuries. Scout had spent the night with his new family, learning to build a proper daybed beneath the overhanging rocks that provided shelter from wind and rain. Samuel had watched from a distance as the female bear demonstrated techniques for creating comfortable sleeping spaces, her cubs mimicking every movement with eager attention. The sight should have brought Samuel joy, his adopted son finding acceptance among his own kind, discovering skills that would ensure survival in the harsh wilderness ahead. Instead, it filled him with a loneliness so profound that breathing became difficult. "You did good, Thomas," Samuel whispered to the wedding ring he still wore after all these years, its gold band tarnished but unbroken despite decades of hard living. "Your pa finally figured out how to let go with love instead of holding on from fear." Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in the morning wind, carrying words she'd spoken during their final conversation before fever claimed her. "Love isn't about keeping someone close, Samuel. It's about helping them become who they're meant to be, even when that takes them far from where we want them to stay." Samuel had thought he understood those words when she'd spoken them. Now, watching Scout integrate seamlessly into wild bear society, he finally grasped their full meaning. The young bear approached Samuel's camp with cautious steps, amber eyes reflecting concern that transcended species barriers. Scout had sensed the change in his human father's condition, the labored breathing, the careful way Samuel moved to accommodate injuries that weren't healing, the gray pallor that spoke of internal damage beyond repair. "Morning, son," Samuel said, his voice rougher than usual, but still carrying the gentle affection that had defined their relationship from the beginning. "How was your first night with the family?" Scout settled beside Samuel with a familiar gesture of companionship. But something had shifted in the young bear's manner. He remained alert to sounds from the direction of his new family, ears swiveling toward calls and movements that belonged to his wild heritage. Samuel reached into his pack and withdrew the bundle of letters he'd carried for 23 years, correspondence between him and Sarah during their brief courtship, when distance and circumstances had kept them apart more often than together. The paper was yellow with age, the ink faded, but the words remained as clear as the day she'd written them. "Your ma, Sarah. She was the wisest person I ever knew," Samuel told Scout, unfolding a letter dated just after Thomas's birth. "Listen to this. Samuel, I know you want to protect our boy from everything that might hurt him, but protection isn't the same as preparation. We have to teach him to be strong enough to face the world without us, because someday that's exactly what he'll have to do." Scout's attention remained focused on Samuel's voice, though the young bear's body language suggested growing awareness of calls from his new family. They were preparing for a morning fishing expedition, and Scout's absence would be noticed if it continued much longer. "She was talking about Thomas then," Samuel continued, "but she might as well have been talking about you. Your pa's job was never to keep you safe forever. It was to make you strong enough to keep yourself safe when the time came." Samuel coughed hard, tasting copper that suggested his internal injuries were worse than he'd admitted to himself. The battle with Blackwood's men had cost him more than pride or peace of mind. It had accelerated damage that years of hard living had already begun. "I won't be coming with you when you leave this valley," Samuel said, the words carrying finality that made Scout's ears prick forward with alarm. "My time for traveling is done, but yours is just beginning." Scout made a soft sound of distress, pressing closer to Samuel's side with insistent warmth. The young bear could sense approaching loss, even if he couldn't understand its implications. "Don't you worry about your old pa," Samuel continued, his weathered hand finding the spot behind Scout's ears that had always calmed them both. "I've got a peaceful place in mind, somewhere I can rest and remember all the good times we shared together." Samuel's fingers worked at the clasp of his wedding ring, sliding the precious band free for the first time since Sarah's death. The metal felt warm from contact with his skin, carrying decades of shared love and accumulated memories. "I want you to have this," Samuel said, working the ring onto Scout's leather collar, where it would rest against the silver conchos already there. "Something to remember that you were loved completely by two parents who would have given anything to see you grow up safe and free." Samuel's hands trembled as he unfolded the bundle of letters he'd carried for over 2 decades. Sarah's graceful handwriting still visible despite the yellowing paper and faded ink. Scout lay beside him in the morning sunshine, but the young bear's attention was divided, part focused on his ailing human father, part drawn to the calls of his new family preparing for their daily activities. "These are letters your ma, Sarah, wrote me during the first year after we met," Samuel explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to hear what she said about love and letting go, because she understood things I'm only learning now." Samuel selected a letter dated 3 months after Thomas's birth, when Sarah's wisdom had been tested by the overwhelming responsibility of motherhood. Her words carried the weight of experience earned through sleepless nights and constant worry. "My dearest Samuel," he read aloud, "I watched our boy take his first steps today while you were checking the trap lines. He fell down 6 times, but each time he got back up with more determination than before. I wanted to catch him, to cushion every stumble, but I realized that would only teach him to depend on me instead of trusting his own strength." Scout's amber eyes remained fixed on Samuel's face, and the man could see understanding there, not of the words themselves, but of the deep emotion behind them. "She was writing about Thomas," Samuel continued, "but she could have been writing about us. About how hard it is to watch someone you love face challenges alone, even when you know that's the only way they'll learn to survive." Samuel's cough had worsened overnight, bringing up blood that he tried to hide from Scout's concerned gaze. The young bear had grown too large and too powerful to remain safely concealed from human society, but Samuel's ability to protect and guide him was failing with each passing day. From the stream below their camp, the female bear called to her cubs, with the authoritative tone that meant immediate obedience was expected. Scout's head turned toward the sound, his body language shifting subtly as wild instincts responded to natural hierarchy. "Go on," Samuel encouraged, seeing the conflict in Scout's posture. "They're your family now. They need to know they can depend on you." But Scout remained at Samuel's side, loyal despite the growing pull of his true nature. The young bear seemed to sense that his human father was approaching some kind of crisis, and protective instincts overrode the call of the wild. Samuel selected another letter, this one written during Thomas's final illness, when Sarah's wisdom had been tempered by the approaching loss of everything they held dear. "Sometimes loving someone means making choices that break your heart," Samuel read, his voice thick with memory. "Our boy is so sick, Samuel, and there's nothing we can do except make him comfortable and tell him how much he's loved. I keep wanting to fight harder, to find some miracle cure, but I think maybe our job now is to help him let go without fear." Samuel folded the letter carefully, his weathered hands gentle with paper that had absorbed tears shed in darkness and hope whispered in desperation. "Thomas died peacefully," Samuel told Scout, sharing the memory he'd never spoken aloud. "Your Ma Sarah held him while he slept, and I told him stories about all the adventures we'd have together someday. He wasn't afraid, because he knew he was loved." Scout made a soft sound that might have been understanding or comfort or simple acknowledgement of shared grief. The young bear pressed closer to Samuel's side, offering the physical presence that had become their primary form of communication. "Your Ma Sarah, she also wrote about you," Samuel continued, pulling out the final letter in the bundle. "She never met you, but somehow she knew you were coming." This letter was different from the others, written in Sarah's hand, but dated just weeks before her death, when fever had already begun affecting her mind. The words were sometimes difficult to decipher, but their meaning remained clear. "Samuel, when I'm gone, you'll think your heart can't love anyone else. But hearts aren't like that. They don't get used up by loving. They get wrongser. Someday you'll find someone who needs the love we've been storing up. And when that happens, don't be afraid to give everything you have. Love isn't diminished by sharing it." Samuel's eyes filled with tears as he finished reading, understanding finally why Sarah had insisted he save these letters through all the years of solitary living. "She was telling me about you, Scout. She knew somehow that love would find a way back into my life, even in this wilderness where I thought I'd come to hide from feeling anything ever again." Scout's response was immediate and instinctive. He moved to lick the tears from Samuel's weathered cheeks, offering comfort with the same gentle attention Samuel had shown during the bear's first difficult nights in the cabin. The carved wooden bear figure fit perfectly in Samuel's weathered palm, its surface smooth, from hours of careful work during long evenings beside dying campfire. He'd captured Scout's distinctive head tilt, the alert ears, the intelligent eyes that had first looked at him with complete trust in that rocky ravine. "This is for you to remember me by," Samuel said, holding the carving where Scout could examine it. "Not that I think you'll forget, but sometimes it helps to have something solid to hold on to when memories start to fade." Scout sniffed the wooden figure with careful attention, recognizing his own scent in the wood that Samuel had handled constantly during its creation. The young bear's amber eyes moved between the carving and Samuel's face, as if trying to understand the significance of this final gift. They had walked together to the edge of the valley where thick stands of pine gave way to open meadows that stretched toward distant mountains. Behind them, Scout's new family called occasionally, not urgently, but with the patient persistence of bears who understood that important decisions took time. "Your real family is back there," Samuel said, nodding toward the sounds of cubs playing and adults fishing in the stream they'd left behind. "The female, she's got wisdom to share about surviving winters, about finding the best denning sites, about raising cubs of your own some." Scout's posture showed the internal conflict that had been growing stronger each day. Part of him wanted to return to the bears who could teach him things no human ever could, but loyalty to Samuel ran deep, strengthened by shared dangers and the unbreakable bonds forged during weeks of complete dependence. "I know you don't want to leave me," Samuel continued, his voice steady despite the effort each word cost him. "But son, staying with me now would be the cruelest thing you could do to both of us." Samuel's condition had deteriorated rapidly since their arrival in the valley. The internal injuries from Blackwood's attack had never healed properly, and the stress of constant travel had pushed his aging body beyond its limits. He could feel systems failing, energy reserves depleted beyond recovery. "Your Pasha's dying, Scout," Samuel said with the direct honesty that had always characterized their relationship. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when that happens, I don't want you to be alone in these mountains with nobody to teach you how to survive without me." Scout made a sound of distress, pressing against Samuel's legs with desperate affection. The young bear had grown so large that Samuel could barely remain upright under his weight, but the gesture carried all the love and loyalty that had defined their partnership. "Easy, boy," Samuel murmured, his hands finding the familiar spot behind Scout's ears. "This isn't goodbye forever. This is just goodbye for now, Until we meet again in whatever place good souls go when their work here is finished." Samuel pulled Scout's head close to his chest, breathing in the wild scent that had become as familiar as his own. The young bear submitted to the embrace with patient trust, understanding somehow that this moment would have to last them both through whatever separation lay ahead. "When I'm gone," Samuel continued, "I want you to live free and wild like your mother intended. I want you to live free and wild like your mother intended. Find a mate who's worthy of your loyalty. Raise cubs who'll carry your strength and wisdom into the future. Make this wilderness safer for the good creatures and more dangerous for the bad ones." The wooden bear figure pressed into Scout's leather collar beside Samuel's wedding ring and the silver conchos taken from Blackwood's equipment. 3 symbols of love, victory, and remembrance that would travel with Scout wherever his wanderings took him. "Most important thing," Samuel said, his voice breaking with emotion he could no longer contain. "Don't you ever forget that you were loved completely. By your birth mother, who died protecting you, by your pa, Samuel, who'd have given anything to see you grow old and free. By every good person who might meet you in the years ahead and recognize the nobility in your heart." Scout's response was immediate and devastating, a soft whimper that spoke of understanding beyond words, acceptance of loss that would reshape both their worlds. The young bear backed away slowly, amber eyes locked on Samuel's face as if memorizing every detail. "Go on now," Samuel whispered, though the words cost him everything he had left. "Your family's waiting, and they need to know you're choosing them freely, not because you had nowhere else to go." Scout took 3 steps toward the distant sounds of his wild family, then stopped and looked back. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, bear and man studied each other across the growing distance that would soon become permanent separation. Then Scout turned and ran toward the life he was meant to live, leaving Samuel alone with memories that would have to sustain him through whatever time remained. 5 years had passed since Samuel Creek walked down from the high country, carrying memories of Scout and the wisdom that comes from loving something enough to let it go. The frontier town of Cedar Falls had grown around him during those years, expanding from a rough collection of trading posts into a proper settlement with a school, a church, and citizens who looked to Samuel for guidance about the wilderness that surrounded their daily lives. Samuel opened his leather-bound journal to a fresh page, the morning sun streaming through his small cabin's window as he prepared to record the day's observations. His handwriting had grown shakier with age, but his dedication to documenting wildlife behavior remained as strong as ever. "May 15th, 1887, he wrote carefully. "Tracks near the North Creek suggest a family of black bears has moved into the area. Mother with 2 cubs, approximately 1 year old. Reminded the school children again about proper food storage and the importance of making noise when traveling forest paths." Samuel had become Cedar Falls' unofficial authority on wilderness safety, teaching newcomers how to coexist peacefully with the animals that had claimed this territory long before humans arrived. His reputation for understanding bear behavior had spread throughout the territory, bringing visitors from distant settlements who sought advice about managing wildlife conflicts. Most people assumed his expertise came from decades of mountain living, which was true enough. They couldn't know that his deepest insights came from 45 days of raising a bear cub, who had taught him more about love and sacrifice than all his years of solitary observation. A knock at his cabin door interrupted Samuel's morning routine. He opened it to find Mary Sullivan, the town school teacher, with a group of children clustered behind her like chicks, following a protective hen. "Mr. Creek," Mary said with the respectful tone she reserved for serious matters, "we were hoping you might tell the children about bear safety again. There have been sightings near the school, and some parents are worried." Samuel welcomed the group into his modest home, noting how the children's eyes widened at the sight of his wildlife sketches, covering every available wall. Bears, elk, mountain cats and eagles gazed down from frames he'd carved himself, each drawing accompanied by careful notes about behavior and habitat. "The most important thing to remember," Samuel began, settling into his familiar role as educator, is that bears aren't evil creatures looking to hurt people. They're intelligent animals trying to raise their families and find enough food to survive. If we respect them and follow simple rules, we can share this beautiful country in peace. 10-year-old Jimmy Walsh raised his hand with the enthusiasm of youth. Mr. Creek, did you ever see a bear up close? Like really close? Samuel's weathered face softened with memory. I did, Jimmy. I once knew a bear who taught me that courage and loyalty aren't limited to humans. He showed me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choosing to love someone, even when that love asks everything of you. The children listened with rapt attention as Samuel shared stories carefully edited for young ears. He told them about intelligence that rivaled human problem-solving, about protective instincts that would shame most parents, about the complex social structures that governed bear community. "Are there really silver bears in the mountains?" asked Sarah Mitchell, a girl whose father logged in the high country and brought home stories of legendary creatures. "There might be," Samuel replied carefully. "Nature sometimes produces individuals that are special, unique. If you're ever lucky enough to encounter something truly rare, the best thing you can do is appreciate it from a distance and let it live free." After the children left, Samuel returned to his journal, adding observations about human nature alongside his wildlife notes. Cedar Falls was changing, growing, bringing both opportunities and challenges that required careful navigation. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Samuel walked to his favorite spot beside the creek that ran through town. The water here was tamer than the mountain streams of his memory, but it still sang the same ancient songs about persistence, adaptation, and the endless cycle of seasons. Movement in the forest across the creek caught his attention. A large bear emerged from thick brush, moving with the confident grace of an animal secure in its own territory. Samuel's breath caught as sunlight revealed silver-tipped guard hairs along the creature's shoulders and neck. The bear paused at the creek's edge, massive head turning toward Samuel's position. For a moment that transcended time, amber eyes met human ones across the flowing water. The bear's leather collar was barely visible through thick fur, but Samuel could see the glint of metal ornaments that caught the fading light. Scout had grown magnificent, easily 400 pounds of muscle and intelligence, every inch the legendary creature his genetics had promised. He was accompanied by a smaller female and 2 cubs who played in the shallows while their parents maintained alert watch. Samuel raised his hand in a gesture of greeting and farewell, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Scout's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slight tilt of his massive head that carried echoes of curiosity and recognition across the years that separated them. Then the bear family disappeared into the forest, leaving Samuel alone with the certainty that love, once given completely, creates bonds that neither time nor distance can break. In his journal that evening, Samuel wrote simply, "Some prayers are answered in ways we never expect, bringing gifts that make every sacrifice worthwhile."